The Museum's summer exhibit, Eternal Mourning, Death and Remembrance in Victorian America. We start off in the sick room with fascinating items from the 18 and 1900s. During the Victorian era, hospitals did exist, but were unsanitary places with frighteningly high rates of death. Germ theory was not yet understood, and hygiene was ignored, with doctors leaving hands unwashed between bloody surgeries. Ugh. Hospitals became houses of death rather than places of healing, leading people to avoid them. Most opted to be treated at home, usually by the women of the household, who were obligated to adopt the role of angels of the house. This ideal mandated an attitude of total selflessness and devotion to the family, making any woman a de facto nurse despite the inaccessibility of formal medical training to women. Baby in a casket doll from the late 1800s. Toys like this, we presume, may have helped children cope with the reality of premature death. This was a reproduction of John Snow's 1854 cholera map. A disease spread by sewage contaminated drinking water. It was the culprit for thousands of deaths in cities during the 19th century. And in London, Dr. John Snow was able to track the source of an 1854 outbreak to a single contaminated water pump using this map, on which the black bars represent cholera deaths. The years of Queen Victoria's reign over the British Empire are commonly referred to as the Victorian era, 1837 to 1901. This was a time of massive industrialization, with the United States becoming a global player on par with the nations of Europe. However, population booms in cramped and unsanitary cities spawned new dangers, skyrocketing rates of sickness and early death, particularly among women and children. In the United States, this was accompanied by the ravages of the Civil War. The Victorian era was also defined by a set of cultural values and fashions characterized by formality, rigidity, and conservatism. The cultural capital of the world was Great Britain, and Queen Victoria its foremost trendsetter. Her white wedding dress set a precedent for bridal style which lasts to this day, and her prolonged period of mourning after the death of her husband, Prince Albert, made waves which reached as far as the war-torn USA. The death, then, of a beautiful woman is unquestionably the most poetical topic in the world. Edgar Allan Poe. As with sickness, death was traditionally handled at home. In the USA, this changed with the Civil War, bringing death out of the home and into battlefield hospitals and embalming parlors. This starkly contrasted the Victorian ideal of the good death, a deeply held, romanticized ideal of a peaceful death in bed surrounded by loved ones and retaining the appearance of sleep. It is worth noting that portrayals of the Victorian good death often center around women and children. While this may be attributed to the disproportionately high mortality rates among these groups, it also fits with a theme of helplessness as a virtue in Victorian culture, evidenced in works of art and literature which romanticized and even eroticized the dead female body itself. The quote by Edgar Allan Poe at the beginning of this section exemplifies this phenomenon, as does his famous poem Annabel Lee, wherein the narrator spends every night lying besides the corpse of his deceased lover. Ah, lovely appearance of death, what sight upon earth is so fair? Not all the gay pageants that breathe can with a dead body compare. Methodist hymn. While death was tragically common throughout the Victorian era, photographs were still relatively hard to come by. The combination of the novelty of photography and death running rampant throughout the era caused post-mortem photography to take off, giving the bereaved one last opportunity to capture an image of lost loved ones. The practice began in 1839 with the invention of the daguerreotype, the first form of photography to be widely commercially available. Post-mortem photographs were not seen as at all grisly or ghoulish by the general public at the time, who would keep them in the form of small cartes de visite meant to be portable personal mementos. As the 20th century progressed, Americans' attitudes towards the dead changed. A number of events contributed to this shift, including the horrors of World War I and the flu of 1918, medical innovations, including the discovery of penicillin, and the movement of the dying process out of homes and into hospitals. On both sides of the Atlantic, many rules of mourning concerned fashion. During their prescribed 3-month mourning period after the loss of a spouse or child, men would don a black band around their upper arm, and one called a weeper around their hat. Women, however, adhered to more rigid rules, which nonetheless varied by community and family. They were expected to wear appropriate mourning clothes for set periods of time following the death of a family member. Following suggests typical mourning periods: a widow for a husband, a year and a day to life; a widower for a wife, 3 to 6 months; parent for a child, 6 to 12 months; child for a parent, 6 to 12 months; grandparent, 6 months; and an aunt or an uncle, 3 months. Women would move from periods of deep to ordinary to light mourning, with accepted attire for each stage. The amount of time spent in each of these 3 stages varied. Deep mourning, the first stage of dress, consisted of black clothing made with heavy, dull fabric such as crepe or bombazine. Black veils would be worn. Bonnets, gloves, shoes, and simple accessories were unrelieved black. Jewelry for this stage was mainly made of jet, a matte black stone that is similar to hard coal. During ordinary mourning, women could abandon the veil and crepe, introduce more ornate jewelry, and add white trim to dresses. For light mourning, lilac and purple and gray were permissible in this last phase of mourning. Jewelry woven from human hair became popular during the Victorian era as a tangible and private way to grieve for lost loved ones. As hair did not decay like the rest of the body, these tokens immortalized the memory of the person. Black mourning jewelry from the late 1800s to the early 1900s were made with jet or onyx to comply with the all-black dress code of widows who wished to remain fashionable. The close of the Mexican Rancho period extends into what we now call the Victorian era. These Rancho families created burial plots on their own property or transported their dead on a long wagon ride to the burial grounds at Mission San Juan Capistrano and Mission San Gabriel. These are the last wishes of Thomas Yorba, who died January 31st, 1845, buried at the San Gabriel Mission Cemetery. I commend my soul to God who created it, and my body to the earth from whence it was fashioned. And it is my wish that I be buried in the shroud of our Father St. Francis, the funeral to be according to what my executory consider that I deserve and is befitting. I declare to have given my wife jewels of some value as a wedding present, but I do not remember how many nor their value, but they must be in her possession since I gave them to her.